everyone, you're watching Newegg TV. I'm Jennifer, and today I'm having a learning experience that I would like you all to come along with me on. I have Paul here, and we're going to be going over the motherboard category. If you're a PC DIYer or you just want to know a little bit more about how your computer functions and why, this is a great video to watch so that you can learn about one of the most integral parts of a computer, which is the central hub or the motherboard. And so why don't we get started with our first question. I kind of have a little outline here up on my laptop to keep us focused. And so what is a motherboard and what is its role in a computer?
Well, thank you, Jenny. Motherboard basically is the central board that everything else in the computer plugs into or connects to somehow. So it operates as sort of an interchange to let your graphics card talk to your CPU, for example, or to let your hard drive talk to the chipset on the motherboard, which then talks to the CPU. So everything's routed through there. When I look at a motherboard, I kind of view it like a big city. There's a bunch of little places on there. You can see little traces that are laid out. Those are kind of like roads that transport the little bits of data back and forth. And it's really essential because everything connects to it, which makes it a fairly complex piece of hardware. You look at a motherboard and you say, wow, there's a lot going on there. But it also makes it pretty reliant on the hardware that you plug into it to function, for one thing. And then also most motherboards can have varying levels of functionality depending on what you connect to it.
What are the tasks and applications that motherboards affect?
Well, much like when you're choosing your CPU, and if you guys are interested in more information on CPUs, you can check out our CPU category video. But much like choosing a CPU, it's important to choose a motherboard that will fit the use case application for the computer that you're building. So for example, you might notice we have a lot of different sizes of motherboards that are out here. So if you're working with a small footprint, you don't have much space for a computer, you might want to choose a smaller motherboard. If you want to all-in-one, over-the-top, tons of expandability, you might want to go with a larger size motherboard. And then apart from that, there's sort of a couple different facets to that question. Because if you choose a CPU, and you install it in a motherboard, chances are, if you look at just that CPU's performance from motherboard to motherboard, it's not going to change that much. Back in the day, many, many years ago, your motherboard could have a pretty significant impact on the actual performance of like your CPU and your memory, and better motherboards could run those parts faster. Nowadays, fortunately, it's pretty universal as far as the CPU performance goes and like your memory performance. But a lot of motherboards will add on extra features, more connectivity, other things that you might be interested in order to get your computer working the way you want to or connecting to the various things that you might want to connect it to. And then also, in some cases, it can be a matter of personal preference if you have a brand that you really like, or if you know that a particular motherboard is built in a certain way. For instance, like an Asus Sabertooth motherboard is designed to be long-lasting and reliable. And if you're building a system and you know, I want to be using this for 5 years, maybe that's a factor that might go into your decision.
It also seems to me that each motherboard, depending on what your build is designed to handle a certain amount of workload. So it's probably pretty important to know or at least have an idea of what you're going to be doing with that particular PC.
Definitely, and we always recommend that if you're building a PC, a do-it-yourself computer from scratch, that you kind of start off from that perspective of what am I planning to use this computer for? Am I going to be gaming? Am I going to just be surfing the internet and watching videos? Am I going to be doing AutoCAD work or video editing or dynamic fluid simulations or something like that? There's a huge range of stuff you can do with computers, so definitely having that in mind from the get-go is going to be very helpful in your purchasing decision, because you always want to give yourself, even if you're buying a motherboard for right now and maybe you're building a system on a limited budget, it really helps to have that sort of future-proofing in mind to some extent, so that you know in the future, well, I can add this card on and give myself more performance or something to that effect.
So you need to have an idea going in is if you're going to be expanding or you need to upgrade, you should plan to buy a board that can accommodate that.
Definitely, and that is one of the benefits of the larger size boards. You'll notice you have a lot more expansion available, so that will give you a lot more of room to add components in the future. But you're mentioning CPU performance, and again, that kind of goes back to the idea that your CPU is, the performance of the CPU is pretty much dictated by the CPU these days. So for instance, if I have an Intel socket motherboard right here with the CPU installed, and then I have another of the same Intel socket motherboards over here with the CPU installed, even though this is a smaller motherboard, the CPU performance, strictly speaking, is going to be about the same on both of those. If you're looking at doing stuff like overclocking, that's another factor. Some motherboards are more designed for overclocking, whereas other motherboards are designed for just running it at stock speeds. So that is one impact that a motherboard can have on your CPU performance, is the ability to overclock and things that are built into the board to help out with that.
Okay, so just a quick recap. When looking at a motherboard, it's important to consider, one, what you're going to be doing with the computer, so that you buy the right amount of motherboard for your purposes, what core you're going to be using, or chip, CPU.
Definitely.
Sorry, let me be technical here. CPU. And also what your future purposes for the computer may be. You don't want to have to swap out a motherboard, you know, if you can at all help it. And also what form factor you would like the finished PC to have.
Yes.
So those are all things that come up under consideration when choosing a motherboard.
Definitely.
So the next thing that we should cover is different motherboard manufacturers, and how do I know which motherboard manufacturer to choose? Are there differences in manufacturers? You mentioned with the Asus that one is purpose-built for overclocking, right, and reliability, but what about some of these others?
Well, there's a huge variety of motherboard manufacturers that are out there. So one of the sort of confusing points for starters is that you're looking at a couple different components. You're looking at a motherboard, you're looking at the processor that goes into the motherboard, because pretty much any motherboard you buy is going to have a socket and doesn't come with that processor installed into it. Although in the future that might change. In the future, depending when you're watching this video, they might be selling motherboards with the CPU soldered directly to it. So that's something that we're not dealing with right now, but might be something to consider if you're watching this video a year or two down the line. But manufacturers, there's AMD and there's Intel. And as of the next generation, AMD and Intel do not make motherboards. But when you're looking at a motherboard, you'll often see that as one of the first things listed. This is an AMD motherboard, or this is an Intel motherboard. That's not referring to the manufacturer of the motherboard itself, that's referring to the manufacturer of the processor and the compatibility of that motherboard. But we're going to come back to CPU compatibility and sockets. So if you're looking at motherboard manufacturers, we have a lot of them represented right here. Asus, Gigabyte, MSI, although we don't have an MSI motherboard here, we do have an MSI laptop. They also make motherboards. We've got some EVGA motherboards here. There's also, for instance, BioStar, ASRock. I hope I'm not forgetting any. ECS. I know there's other ones out there too, and I apologize if I'm forgetting all of them, but that's a fair amount of them. Now, again, this kind of goes a little bit more towards personal preference, because when you're comparing different motherboards, say you're looking at a specific price point, you can look at all the different bells and whistles that motherboard manufacturer might have added on. But I would recommend check the reviews on Newegg.com. Look up a motherboard, check the reviews. That could even apply to motherboards you're not even considering, but if you look at, say, an Asus reviews for all of their motherboards, that could give you a good idea of maybe the Asus type of quality you can expect. Same goes for Gigabyte or MSI or any of the other motherboard manufacturers out there. And yeah, so it's not really our place here to say, choose this manufacturer or this manufacturer. I think a lot of them have their strengths. So really doing a little bit of research in that area can help you kind of determine the type of motherboard or the specific motherboard manufacturer that you want to go with. Another thing that you might consider there is going to be their post-sale performance. So that's another great thing to do when you're reading reviews. You can read reviews and say, oh, I got this motherboard, it had a problem, they were really quick to replace it. You might read another review that says, I got this motherboard, it had a problem, I had to wait for service and that sort of thing. So that's really up to the motherboard manufacturers to kind of maintain that likability and that level of service for the customers. But also
a great resource if you need help trying to figure out, you know, things like what is the best motherboard for your purposes and things like that. We do have a great community online, the Egg Expert Forums, and so you can jump on there and get pretty quick results from our community of customers who actually do DIY building, or if you're just getting into it and you want some really quick live feedback, that would be an excellent way. So a recap on what to look for when buying a motherboard, and motherboard manufacturers, you need to consider, again, what are you going to be doing with the motherboard? And when you're looking at different manufacturers, read up on the reviews. So set your budget and then compare and contrast like what you want to do with the motherboard, what your purposes and intents are, and then check out the reviews on the performance of that particular motherboard. Here we're very objective in that we don't play favorites with any one brand or anything like that at Newegg TV. So definitely check out our forums and the reviews online to find out if the motherboard that you're selecting is going to meet your needs in terms of customer service and support.
Definitely.
As well.
I agree.
Okay, so now we're going to talk about processors and processor compatibility and sockets.
Because honestly, when I'm building a new computer or when I'm choosing parts for a new computer, if a friend asks me to do a build for them or something, that's usually where I start, is what processor I'm going to use. And again, we've got AMD and we've got Intel processors. So that's step one, maybe choosing which one. Again, this is something where you might want to rely on reviews, going back and forth to sort of see where the processors might have their strengths or their weaknesses. And then within each manufacturer, there's also a couple different sockets that might be available. So there's another area where it helps to have a little bit of research done so you can determine the difference. Intel, for example, divides their two lines of processors into what they call enthusiast. And enthusiast processors are typically more expensive, but also very high performance processors. That's the only place for Intel where you can get, for example, a 6-core processor right now. That's also going to feature stuff like hyper-threading. So it's a great way to go if you know that you really need a heavy-duty computer. Again, if you're doing a lot of heavy lifting, if you're doing video editing, something like that. And again, that is their enthusiast line. Right now, the socket for that is socket 2011. Okay. And there's a couple different series of processors that are available. They're typically known by their code names, which would be Sandy Bridge E and Ivy Bridge E. So this one actually that I'm holding in front right here is a Sandy Bridge E processor, a 3970X, and then the box that's behind it is for a Ivy Bridge E processor, which is a 4960X. But either of these will slot into a socket 2011 motherboard. And again, this is the enthusiast line, so you'll find these are a bit more expensive, but again, the performance that goes along with that is, generally speaking, pretty epic. The mainstream line of Intel processors is represented right now by this guy right here. This is their newest processor, or one of their newest processors, which is the i7-4770K. The socket for this is LGA 1150. Intel, by the way, defines their sockets by the number of pins that are in there, and Intel also has what is known as the LGA socket land grid array, which means that the CPU itself only has a bunch of gold contact pads there on the bottom and no actual pins that stick out. The pins that stick out are on the motherboard itself. But since this is a motherboard video, not a CPU video, we just need to point out that there's different CPUs available, so make sure you're compatible. Another CPU that's still available right now is Intel's Ivy Bridge processors. Not Ivy Bridge E, that would be the enthusiast platform, but just Ivy Bridge. Those would be 3000 series processors, so like a 3770K. Those are on a different socket, LGA 1155, so it's not compatible with the same motherboards as this socket. So that's a really key elements to go into your motherboard purchasing decision. Choosing what CPU you want to use based on its performance characteristics, and then choosing the right socket, of course, to be compatible with that CPU so that you know you can install it and that it's going to work. Over on the AMD side, over here on the right, they also have a couple different lines of processors that are currently available. The tin right here is from their FX series of processors. Those currently use the AM3 Plus socket, so I happen to have one of those right here. You'll notice I have it on a bit of foam because these processors from AMD have pins on them. So those are the pins right there. They're very delicate, so this is one of those elements when you're installing a CPU into a motherboard, you want to be really careful of the pins. In fact, my finger actually touching some of those on the edge is not good, but I'm being careful, I promise. So FX series of processors from AMD go more towards their performance processors. You can get them in up to 8 core varieties, which is really good if you know that you're using software, for example, that's heavily multi-threaded that can take advantage of all those cores. And then apart from their mainstream desktop series right here, they also have what they are calling APUs, or accelerated processing units. Those currently have a couple different sockets available as well. So whereas the FX series has socket AM3 Plus that it's compatible with, the APUs right now have the originally introduced socket, which is FM1, and then that's recently been replaced by FM2, and those are not interoperable. So if you are going for an APU, I would recommend right now at least going for an FM2 version, and then the CPUs themselves, which might look very similar if you're just looking at the top of it. You will notice the big reason why it's important to pay attention to socket compatibility, because you might notice that the layout of pins there on the back is significantly different. And you know what I just did? I actually switched these two processors when I was setting them up. This is the FX processor,
oh, all right.
which I realized looking at the pins right there.
Let me show you.
That's the FX processor right there, and then Jenny can hold up the FM2 processor right next to it. The pin configurations are different on those, so if you were, for instance, to attempt to install an FX processor into an FM2 socket, you might end up bending some pins. That's a really bad thing to do. You're probably going to damage your processor, often beyond repair. So just something to keep in mind. It kind of goes hand in hand with the DIY scene, but being careful with your processor is gonna be very well. It's preventative. It helps you from breaking them before you actually install it into the motherboard. So that's usually a starting off point for choosing the motherboard. Which CPU do you want to use? The other thing, by the way, when you're talking about the APUs over here, as well as Intel's mainstream line of processors, is that these actually have graphics cores integrated onto them, which means that whereas with the more high level or the more enthusiast platforms here, you would need to buy a graphics card as well in order to have a video out to power your monitor. The APUs over here and the Intel mainstream processors have graphics built in. It's not going to give you the same level of graphics performance that you get with like a discrete video card, but it is still there, so that might be something else to consider. You can actually set up a basic system again for like web browsing and light gaming with one of these processors, and you don't even have to worry about buying a graphics card. One
of the bits of jargon that get thrown around here a lot is chipset, and I'm going to be honest, I don't know exactly what that means. So let's talk about that for a moment.
Well, a chipset originally referred to a set of things that a chip can do. That's probably a bit of an oversimplification. But so as we mentioned, the motherboard is main function is to sort of tie everything together and let different pieces communicate back and forth with each other. The chipset is going to be an element on the motherboard that's built in there. It's sort of a middleman in between some of the other things that you can plug in and the processor. And then there's also a few different things to bear in mind when you're talking about chipset. Chipset might be a compatibility factor for you, depending. Most of the current generation of sockets, for example, if I have a socket AM3 Plus motherboard for AMD, like this one right here, and I have a socket AM3 Plus CPU, that means that CPU should fit in and it should work no problem most of the time. There are certain situations where you need to take the chipset into consideration as well. Fortunately, again, with most modern configurations, that's not really something to keep in mind, but there are different chipsets. Some of them have different levels of performance and capabilities. AMD, for example, right now with their mainstream platform, again, this is an AM3 Plus motherboard. Actually, you have a configuration that's been around for a while, which is they have what is known as a North Bridge chipset and a South Bridge chipset. Intel motherboards right now, they just have a single chipset. So this motherboard, for example, has the 990FX North Bridge chipset, which is underneath this heatsink right here. And then it also has the, I believe it's the SB950, although I hope I'm not wrong about that, which is the South Bridge chipset, which is down here. Those both connect to different areas of the motherboard and handle different things, but that's just something that you might hear when you're talking about chipset is North Bridge and South Bridge. If there's not a North Bridge and a South Bridge, typically you'll just hear chipset, and that's referring to the single chipset on the motherboard. So by comparison, if I pull over an Intel motherboard here, this is a socket. Actually, which socket is this? This is a Z87 board, if I'm not mistaken. Yes. So this is an LGA1150 socket for Intel's mainstream platform of processors. And this one just has a single chipset, which is located under this heatsink right here. that is known as the Z87 chipset. So again, it's pretty uniform right now when it comes to the chipsets that are available. If you go back a couple generations with Intel, for example, they actually had a few chipsets that they came out with. So when Sandy Bridge first launched, which was their second generation processors, you had a P67 chipset, you had an H67 chipset, and then later on you had a Z68 chipset, and that led to a little bit of confusion from folks. Fortunately, they simplified things a little bit more. But referring to the chipset that's used in the motherboard and the characteristics of that chipset, like often the chipset will control some serial ATA ports, and having what is known as native control over your serial ATA by the chipset will often give a little bit of a performance boost. But apart from a chipset on a board, then you might have other chips that are integrated onto the board. Chipset is sort of a larger term that refers to sort of a larger chip that's on the board, and it's more integral to the motherboard itself and the performance, versus add-on chips. So for instance, this chip controls 6 serial ATA ports, but I'm pretty sure there are other boards that are out here which have given you additional serial ATA ports. So for instance, this motherboard here, which is an X79 chipset for the Socket 2011 Enthusiast platform, and this motherboard has 8 serial ATA ports. 6 of them, these 6 right here, are natively controlled by the chipset. These 2 here have an add-on chip. So it's an extra chip they put onto the motherboard. That chip then communicates with the chipset, and then that chipset communicates with the processor, and it adds just the tiniest degree of latency, and that's why what is known as native connection is often preferable. But by adding on chips, they can give you additional functionality, and again, that's one of those ways that motherboard manufacturers can kind of distinguish their boards, because there'll be a basic level of functionality for Z87, for example, for Intel's most current chipset that's out. Every motherboard that has a Z87 chipset can access the features of that chipset, so you'll find a lot of universal elements across boards that use the exact same chipset.
Okay, so a quick kind of layman's recap on chipset is it's referring to an additional chip on the board, and sometimes in the case of a few boards it may have a few chips, right? So you have the north and south chips, depending on what it's going to be doing, but those additional chips function in conjunction with the CPU, not as separate units from it.
Yes.
Hence motherboard unifying.
You have to have that CPU in there in order for it to talk to the chipsets to control what the chipsets might be controlling.
Right.
Yeah.
Got it. Okie dokie. So the next thing we need to discuss is the form factor of all the motherboards. Now there are different names for different sizes of motherboards. There's mini ITX, micro ATX, ATX. Translate. What does this mean?
You got most of the big ones in there. So let's set up a quick little demonstration here so we can give people more of a side-by-side. And oh, wait, I have another one down here. So when it comes to form factor, there's a bunch of them out there. I usually, at least at this point, kind of revert to the most popular ones. The most popular ones, at least in my eyes at this time, are going to be your standard ATX, which has been around for quite some time. Actually, let's put that one on that side. So standard ATX, and that is the Asus Sabertooth board that I've posted right over there. You have micro ATX, which is sort of a not quite as long version of that. And can you scoot that over just a little bit more? Thank you. Micro ATX, so there's an example of micro ATX there in the middle. And mini ITX. So those are kind of the most common form factors that you're going to see right now. Again, this is something that you really should keep in mind when you're initially setting up your computer. But standard ATX is larger, of course. Gives you the benefit of having a bit more surface area on the board for additional components to be added in. And then the expansion slots, which are located towards the bottom of the board down here, is really the biggest gain or loss depending on the form factor you're going with. Going with a full standard ATX motherboard is going to give you a total of 7 and sometimes, well, usually just about 7 expansion slots depending on the layout of the board, which is more than what you get with micro ATX, for example, which gives you 4 expansion slots down there in the bottom. And then finally we have mini ITX, which is gaining a lot of popularity lately due to the small form factor, and a lot of people want to build console replacement type computers or something that just sits in a really small footprint. So mini ITX has become very popular. You only get a single expansion slot on the board itself, which is down there at the bottom. But for a lot of people who are just setting up a basic gaming system, if the board has everything else that they need already integrated, that means they can drop in a graphics card in that single expansion slot and it'll basically be good to go. Going from smallest to largest here, mini ITX, micro ATX, and standard ATX over there. But that is not the limit of the boards that are available. There's other form factors that are available. This is something that you might be interested in if you're looking for something a bit more exotic. So here is a pretty new form factor, at least relatively new. This is the same mini ITX size when it comes to this measurement, which is 6.7 by 6.7 inches. But this is a thin mini ITX motherboard, which means it adheres to a standard for vertical height as well as the layout of the board itself. So you'll notice thin mini ITX is very thin. The I/O there, for example, is half the height, and this form factor actually has a specific positioning for the CPU socket right here, and then the coolers that you'll see for this board are actually very flat, so they lay down kind of on top of the CPU like that and expand off to the side. So this is a form factor that's been introduced to aid in DIY small form factor computers, and more specifically like all-in-one computers, so where you buy a little monitor that also has a chassis housed in it, and you can set up a really, really small form factor computer using thin mini ITX. So there's a couple.
Actually, we just did a video recently, or Joanne just did a video recently on a new EVGA case that comes with a built-in power supply. So this would be a card for that type of application.
Yes, I believe that's the EVGA Hadron, and that one is a mini ITX form factor, so it's not specifically designed for the thin mini ITX. But that is a great example of a really small portable form factor chassis, and also of that form factor, which has really been gaining a lot of momentum in the PC space and DIY space, because people like having that really compact type of system. But thin mini ITX is something to keep in mind. We also have some very large form factor motherboards over here that we wanted to share with you guys, just because they're large and oversized and all that good stuff. So first off, we'll start with something that is also pretty common, and that is eATX, or extended ATX. So you'll find quite a few eATX motherboards that are out there. Basically, eATX boards are a bit wider, so you'll notice that they extend a bit further on this side than a standard ATX motherboard. So I could probably hold this up right in front and sort of give you guys a relative comparison. As you can see, the EVGA board is extending a little bit further out on that side. So that's just a wider form factor, and again, that just adds a little bit more surface area on the board so that they can add some additional componentry. And that's a big factor if you're choosing a case, though, because most mid-tower sort of standard form factor cases will only support up to standard ATX. So definitely double check with your whatever case you're choosing. Here's another one that you might not have seen very often. This is XL-ATX. This is another form factor that's
is that extra long ATX?
Yes, extra large, extra long. I couldn't tell you exactly what that stands for off the top of my head, but this is a form factor that we've really only seen a few motherboards based on. Originally EVGA. We also had an MSI and Gigabyte, which did some boards on this with the X58 chipset, which is also Intel's last generation enthusiast platform, has been eclipsed for several years now. But there's an example of an XL-ATX, and this board is both a bit wider and a bit taller than a standard ATX motherboard. So again, that is out there. You might see it, and that's just one of those things where you should really double check and make sure that your case is going to fit it. Now, another one that we have over here.
This one's a beast.
This one is huge. And this is actually, again, a last generation motherboard that we're showing you, just to kind of show you the different types of form factors that you might find with motherboards. So this one is known as HPTX. And HPTX is huge motherboard.
Humongous platform, ATX.
Hey, that could totally be it. Usually it's much more simple than you might expect it to be. So HPTX, and this is another unique motherboard because you'll notice there are actually 2 CPU sockets, one right here and one right there. So this is again an X58 chipset motherboard. This is socket 1366, which was the forerunner to the 2011 socket CPUs that were shown here. So this motherboard is a little bit older, although this is a very popular motherboard for the time because on that platform a dual CPU configuration was quite beastly and could perform quite well. But again, HPTX, just one of those form factors that you don't see very often. When you do see it, because it is so huge, you'll probably see it with dual CPU configurations. And EVGA does have an SRX version of this motherboard that has a couple socket 2011 sockets on it, and we did a build with that, and again, quite beastly. Apart from that, that's pretty much all of the motherboards we have to show you guys right here as far as a demonstration. But you might also see motherboards that say SSI, which stands for Server System Infrastructure. I always forget what that stands for, but there's SSI EEB and SSI CEB. And again, those are just other form factor standards. Those are made more for server chassis. But if you look at the form factor of your motherboard, look at your case and what form factors it supports, and make sure they match up, and your motherboard should fit in your case.
So this, again, as a recap, again, speaks back to, you know, knowing and planning your build before you make purchases, because you don't want to have to, you know, buy a case first and then realize that it doesn't hold the motherboard that is going to do the job in terms of what you want your PC to do. And, you know, at the same time, you don't want to buy a motherboard first and then find out that it's not going to fit the processor that you've chosen. So it's all about planning your parts, you know, in the correct configuration for your needs.
That's very true, and that's definitely also one of the biggest qualms I think people have when they're trying to set up a DIY system or a build-it-yourself system, is making sure that that intercompatibility is there, making sure everything's going to work when you get all the parts and put them together. And that's definitely probably one of the biggest things for motherboards, again, because there's so many different things that connect to them, and you want to make sure that everything that you're planning to plug in and connect is going to fit. So.
All right, well, the next thing about motherboards that's important to take into consideration is how hot they get inside your computer. So we need to talk a little bit about CPU coolers now.
So yeah, CPU cooler is definitely another good factor, something to keep in mind. Fortunately, at this point, there's been a lot of standardization. So for AMD, for example, and I got one of their boards again right here, their little saber-toothed, AMD has been using the same cooler mounting system for a long time, which is a godsend if you have a favorite cooler that's even 5 or 6 years old, because if you have a good working cooler, clean the dust off of it, it's going to keep working, chances are. So that's a very nice thing for AMD, whether you're talking about the FM1 or the FM2 sockets, or the AM sockets, AM2, AM2+, AM3, and AM3+, which they've been doing on their mainstream platform for quite some time. They have a standard mounting system here, so if you're going to go with what is known as an aftermarket CPU cooler, you can drop it right in and it will install correctly. Intel has gone with a lot of the same tech when it comes to their mainstream line of processors. So here again is, this is a socket 1150 motherboard, but the actual layout here of the socket and the spacing of these has been the same. Intel has maintained the same spacing there, going all the way back to socket 1156, which is a good 4 years old now. So 1156, socket 1155, and now socket 1150 all have that same layout, which means that you're going to have compatibility with your CPU coolers, even if you're carrying over an old one from an older system or something like that. But keeping your CPU cool is definitely important. And apart from that, fortunately, most motherboards these days, the parts on the motherboards themselves physically don't get too hot. If you are going for like an overclocking motherboard or something like that, you might see this type of thing, which is located around it. So these are big heat sinks, which are going to help to remove some of the heat from the power delivery area. And speaking of which, we might as well talk about power delivery right now. Since we're talking about CPU cooling, the other elements around the CPU is known as power delivery. You have what is known as chokes, caps, and MOSFETs. The MOSFETs are what the heat sink's actually sitting on. The chokes are those little square pieces that you can kind of see sitting right underneath it, and the caps are the cylindrical capacitors that you see on there. Those basically handle the transfer of the power from where it comes into the motherboard via the power connectors to the CPU itself. And again, that's an area where you'll see much beefier designs when it comes to overclocking motherboards, whereas with a non-overclocking motherboard, you'll have a simpler design, but it will always be designed to fit within that envelope that the CPU is supposed to run at. So this motherboard, for example, as you can see, doesn't really have a whole lot of, say, cooling going on in the power delivery. You can see some of those exposed elements for the power delivery right there. But since this is a small form factor motherboard, and chances are this isn't going to be used for really extreme overclocks, that's still going to do the job just fine. So that's another thing to bear in mind when you're looking at motherboards is if you're going to overclock, if that's something you're interested in, it might be worth paying a few more extra bucks for something that has the power delivery configuration set up that will aid in a nice stable overclock for you.
Okay. And again, that would come from just doing your homework and doing your research. Most of these products, if you are just getting into DIY, you will find the frustration that I have found is that there is not a lot of information on the box to answer those types of questions. So definitely look at reviews, do your research, get on the Egg Expert forums, and find out what motherboards will fit that particular need. If that is what you're looking to do, you need to have a motherboard that is purpose-built for it. And also, when looking at motherboards, for anyone who's never really taken a look and looking at the coolers, you might kind of wonder why they are designed the way they are. I can actually answer that it's because they're trying to expose as much surface area on that cooler as they can. So the waves and fins and the way it's all configured is actually a brilliant piece of engineering on the part of the designers to try to maximize the amount of surface area on that particular cooler so that as air transfers over it, the air is cooling as much as possible, which is pretty neat. I like engineering and stuff like that.
I do too, and that's another place that the cooler that you choose can actually help with that, is the cooler is not just dispersing heat from the CPU, but it's also usually pushing some extra air over the surface of the board.
Right.
That just helps moving that warm air away so that it can more effectively dissipate more heat that continues to generate as you use your computer.
Right. Okay, so now we need to talk about memory. And for a while, my brain had a difficult time separating memory from storage, but I think I've got that straight now. So why don't we talk about memory and different memory configurations on motherboards?
Yeah, and that's a very good point to distinguish between memory and storage. But basically, memory is what is known as volatile, which means that it only has information stored in these memory chips while your computer's on and while there's power running through it. That's as compared to permanent storage, which would be a hard drive or a solid state drive. Those will maintain whatever bits of data are on them even when the power is off. So memory is made to be extremely fast so that your computer can access it. It can sort of act as a repository for it to drop stuff into that it needs to pull up very quickly. And when you initially launch a program or something like that, that's usually the computer going to your permanent storage, pulling data off of it, loading it onto the memory so that it can access it more quickly. This is another area where, fortunately, there's a lot of hegemony over the past 3, 4, 5 years. This is DDR3 memory that I'm showing you right now. You might notice it has listing for the capacity of the memory itself, which is 2 gigabytes, so you always see that with memory. The type of memory it is, which is DDR3, and DDR3 is a universal standard, whether you're talking about AMD or Intel motherboards right now. They're all using DDR3. And then you also see a memory speed, and this is going to be really reliant on the processor that you're using, what types of memory speeds are compatible, but we're going to do a separate memory video that gets into that a lot more. So again, DDR3 memory, and then apart from that, as long as you're choosing DDR3 memory, it should slot into the board, and you just want to double check what type of memory interface that your processor has. So here's a quick memory install. It's as easy as that. You open up the slots, make sure that that little off-center divot is lined up, and simply push down to drop it in. And then currently for the AMD processors and Intel's mainstream processors are set up for dual channel configurations, which means that you want to have a matched pair of memory. So for instance, this motherboard here only has 2 slots installing a match pair, and that will allow it to access both of those sort of synchronously, which will give you some additional memory bandwidth and will improve the performance of your computer. For Intel's enthusiast platform right now, X79, right here, for example, it actually uses what's called quad channel memory. So let me pull a sticker off, for example. So you notice you actually have a total of 8 memory slots on this motherboard, and it's actually set up in a set of 4. So your motherboard manual will tell you which of those memory slots you should be populating with your memory kit. But if you buy a matched set of 4 with this, you can install all 4 of them, and that will give you, again, additional bandwidth that the CPU can access. And that's one of the big features of this platform from Intel, is the available memory bandwidth and the quad channel memory configurations, which is, again, maybe not so helpful for your day-to-day tasks like web browsing and that sort of thing, or even playing video games. But if you're doing workstation type tasks or video editing or something to that effect, it can be a great benefit to have as well. You might also have noticed with that SR2 motherboard that actually had triple channel memory.
Yeah, it's huge.
Although that form factor has becoming more and more legacy at this point. So pretty much you got dual channel and quad channel right now, depending on what you're set up, DDR3. And the only other wrench that might be thrown into your memory selection choice, again, this might depend on what motherboard you're using, but occasionally, particularly with these small form factor motherboards, you actually have them using desktop memory. I'm sorry, laptop memory.
Laptop memory.
So this is still DDR3 memory, but this is what is known as an SO DIMM. So DDR3 SO DIMMs are designed specifically for use in originally laptops, but you will notice that our little thin mini ITX motherboard here, in order to save space and as well as the Z height of the actual motherboard itself, or the completed motherboard with everything connected, and so they've gone and used laptop memory. So keep that in mind. Typically you'll only see it with small form factor motherboards, but these are really easy to install. Again, it's a universal standard, so you're not going to have any trouble as long as you're buying a DDR3 SO DIMM for the compatible motherboard. You just drop it in like that, snap it down, and that's how you install it. Of course, if I was installing 2 of these, I would have gone with the lower channel first, because now it's blocked.
Now, memory needs, and obviously this is a whole conversation we're going to have in a memory video, but I think we should just touch on that memory has to be installed in pairs, correct?
It doesn't necessarily have to be. You can run any of these motherboards with a single stick of memory, but really if you want to take advantage of the motherboards and the processor's capabilities and use everything that's been set up for you, you would want to use a matched pair of memory with a dual channel capable system, or you'd want to use a set of 4 sticks of memory with a quad channel system, for example.
And also, since I'm working on right now my first rig and putting those parts together, I've been looking at the mini ITX. And one thing that Kyle pointed out to me was like, well, if you want it to do, be a workstation and be a gaming computer that will last you and keep you happy for a while, be aware that when you buy your memory, to buy a larger pack instead of the smaller, because on these particular boards you only have the 2 slots, which means that when you upgrade you have to get rid of the memory, all of the memory you have, and upgrade it to the next size. So it's better when you only have 2 slots to get the biggest memory stick kit that you can afford at the time, and put it in there, because on the larger boards, you have more slot space, so when you upgrade, you don't have to get rid of that whole kit. You can just add another kit.
Yeah, and that's one of the give and takes with going with the small form factor. You do get that smaller footprint, but like you said, only 2 DIMM slots here versus some of these other ones that have 4 or even 8 slots. If you're talking some of the nice X79 boards that are available. So yeah, if you put 2 4 gig DIMMs in here, and then in the future you wanted to expand to 16, you would basically need to get rid of those 2 4 gig DIMMs and replace them with 8 gig DIMMs. So upgradability further down the line, definitely something to consider. And again, if you're trying to do more with your computer, that's always a good reason to possibly go with a larger form factor, and that gives you more expandability down the line.
Right. Okay, so up next we want to talk about our video card slot.
Definitely, and this is another thing that we're going to be doing a separate video card discussion video on, so hopefully we won't spend too much time, although this is a pretty in-depth video. So basically, for a video card right now, there's one interconnect for it, or one way to plug it into your motherboard. It's known as PCI Express. It's been around for quite some time, and then there's a few different generations of it. Physically, the plugs are always the same, so I can show you that. Basically, these are your expansion slots down here. These are all PCI Express slots. You have the smaller area of it right here, and that's simply providing power. And then you have all of these pins, which are providing a data connection between any card that you might drop in here and your CPU. So the full-length slots like these are known as X16. The shorter slots like this one, for example, is an X4. And then there's also, you'll find X1, X2, X4, X8, and X16. You can also sometimes have slots, you can sort of see the reflection of the pins on this slot right here, but sometimes you can have slots where you will have physically an X16 slot, but the pins will only go halfway, and that means that it's only actually wired up for an X8. That being said, graphics cards these days are going to be either PCI Express Gen 2 or PCI Express Gen 3. Again, physically that slot is the same. It's simply Gen 3 provides essentially double the bandwidth between the slot and the CPU, which isn't really a factor. Most video cards right now can't even saturate the amount of bandwidth that you had with PCI Express Gen 2. But going with PCI Express Gen 3 can often give you a little bit of a performance improvement. And again, that's going to be dependent on the CPU itself. So you can double check your motherboard when you're shopping for it, and if you really know that you're going to be buying a current generation or brand new graphics card, you want to make sure that you have plenty of forward compatibility. Going with the PCI Express Gen 3 can be a good choice there. But as long as you have a full-length X16 slot, which every single one of these motherboards has, some of them are PCI Express Gen 2 and some of them are PCI Express Gen 3, that means that you can drop in that video card and basically get up and running. There's other factors to keep in mind, like a power supply to provide power to the video card, but we'll cover that in the video card video. But pretty much most of your mainstream motherboards, I should say the one exception right here is going to be this little motherboard. This one simply has one X4 slot right there. So this motherboard is going to be more designed, since it's so small. They're really designing this one to fit into such a small system. They're probably going to be relying on the integrated graphics from your CPU. So that's
situation.
one other thing to keep in mind is for the platforms right now that have integrated graphics, which would be AMD's FM1 and FM2 sockets, APUs, as well as Intel's mainstream CPUs. You will actually have video outs on the motherboard itself. So you can see right here some DisplayPort, HDMI, and DVI outs, which means that once you have your CPU installed here, you don't even need a graphics card, but the graphics card is going to give you a lot better graphical performance, particularly if you're playing higher-end 3D games or AAA titles like your Battlefield 4 or your Metro or that sort of thing.
Yeah, and you really want to take advantage of all of the resolution available to you, because that's the whole point, is you're trying to have the best experience you can have, whether you're gaming or you're doing video editing or photo editing. You want to make sure that that image quality is really what it all boils down to, is you want to build this so that you have the best possible image quality.
Yes. So make sure, of course, you got a full-length X16 PCI Express slot, which the vast majority of motherboards on the market will have right now, no matter what platform you're looking at. And then again, if you're looking for higher-end graphics, or another thing to keep in mind is if you're looking for multiple graphics cards in the future, such as an SLI for NVIDIA or Crossfire for AMD graphics cards, you can actually combine more than one graphics cards together. Typically, looking at the processors and the platforms we have available right now, your Intel mainstream and your AMD FX processors will happily handle one or two graphics cards. The FX processors can go beyond that, of course. And then if you're really looking for a high-end gaming system, 3 or 4 graphics cards, in that case, I would recommend going with either the high-end AMD FX processor or the Intel Extreme Edition processors, or their enthusiast platform, because this is going to give you a lot more bandwidth between the processor and the PCI Express lanes to handle those multiple graphics cards.
Great. I think that's about as brief as we could possibly keep that. Yeah. So let's move on to talking about now are the different drives available. So we have SSD, HDD, and optical.
Yes. So this is again something where fortunately there's a lot of standardization that has happened. So really you have one connection type physically that's available for that. That's known as serial ATA. And let's see if I can find some right angle serial ATA. Oh, Steve's already found them. Okay, so here's some serial ATA ports right over here. You'll notice they're different colored. So whereas physically, again, these are the same. So any serial ATA plug, you can plug into that, connect the other end to your SSD, your hard drive, or your optical drive. These ports themselves are not always made the same. I mentioned earlier how some of the ports will be natively controlled. So for example, the brown ports on this board are natively controlled by the SB950 Southbridge chipset, which means you get a direct connection between there. You'll also see what is known as a revision number with serial ATA. So they originally had serial ATA, which was just serial ATA. When they came out with new ones, they dubbed that serial ATA revision 1. They also have serial ATA revision 2 and serial ATA revision 3. So revision 2 and revision 3 are pretty much what you'll see on motherboards these days. If you see revision 1, chances are that's a much older motherboard, and it's an older motherboard. But I would definitely say make sure you have at least a couple serial ATA revision 3. That gives you 6 gigabits per second of available bandwidth between the device you're connecting and the chipset or the CPU. And particularly if you're going with an SSD, which are really fast and really popular, and I really like SSDs. I recommend getting one if you want a really excellent computing experience. Make sure you've got some SATA Rev 3 available, because SSDs will be bottlenecked by SATA Revision 2. SATA Revision 2 should be more than enough if you're connecting an optical drive or a more traditional spinning mechanical hard drive, because those don't have quite the amount of data that they can read or write at the same time. So Revision 2 port is fine for that.
Okie doke. And the last thing that we need to discuss is the PSU compatibility. So power supply unit, that was something that I was confused about on the thin board here, is that its power supply compatibility is external.
Yeah, and this is definitely not something that is very typical for building doing a DIY computer. Excuse me. This form factor is very new, so most of the time you will not be using an external power unit like this one is designed for right here. Most of the time you'll have a discrete power supply in your system, and you'll have at least a couple cables that need to run over from the power supply and plug into the motherboard itself. So we'll go back over to our little mini ITX guy right here. So the standard ATX power connector for a motherboard is located right here. It's a 24-pin. Older motherboards, you might see a 20-pin, but 24-pin is pretty standard these days. And then apart from that one, you also have a supplemental plug, which is located right over here, and this is a 4-pin. This has been around since the Pentium days, but this is basically introduced specifically to provide extra power to the CPU, so you'll hear that often referenced as a supplemental CPU power connector. And this one can be either 4-pin or 8-pin. So when you're choosing your power supply for your system, let's say you've already chosen your motherboard, just make sure that you have the 24-pin, which you're pretty much always going to have. And then for your CPU power, make sure you've got at least the 4-pin. And some motherboards that have an 8-pin, you can actually just plug a 4-pin in and it will work just fine as long as you're not overclocking. And then other motherboards, such as this one right here, and Steve, this is all the way at the top of this one, so I apologize. But apart from the 24-pin, this one's designed for overclocking. So all the way at the top here, you've actually got 2 supplemental 8-pin CPU power connectors. So that's another thing to take into consideration. If you are going for a higher-end system, it might have additional power connectors for the motherboard. So make sure you get a power supply that is compatible and has those connectors, so you can plug those in and get all of the features that your motherboard has integrated onto it.
And also just a note on PSUs, you also want to make sure that you are buying enough power supply for what you intend to do. So if, you know, most video cards, or all video cards, will come with some guidance on the box for that. And the recommendation is usually, if you can go with a larger wattage, go with it.
Yes, it's usually good to have some headroom on your power supply that will help it operate more efficiently, and also give you the availability of adding additional components to your computer in the future. So for instance, I built a computer for my friend a few weeks ago, which could easily have operated on a, say, 550, 600 watt power supply. I gave him an 800 watt power supply because I knew there's a good chance he wanted to get another video card and drop it in there in the future, so that gave him some headroom. So those two plugs, the 24 pin and the supplemental CPU power connector, are kind of the typical connectors that you'll see on most motherboards. There are some additional power connectors you might see from time to time. So for instance, on this X79 board here, since this board is designed to handle multi-video card configurations, sometimes the power that's available directly through this little slot, or particularly if you're actually populating a lot of these, separating the power out over all of those can lead to some voltage droop or the power to drop out at some time. So they've added this extra 6-pin power connector to the board. This is a power connector that you would typically see on a graphics card. It's a PEG or PCI Express graphics connector. But basically this is there to plug in if you're really maxing out the board. A lot of times you'll see a supplemental one like this. You can go without it if you're just using 1 or 2 cards, but if you're really plugging in a lot of stuff to your expansion slots, then that is there to provide some extra juice there to make sure that all the cards have all the power they need. And then I'm not sure if I have a board with an example of it here, but apart from them using, oh, I do right here. Oh, Steve already found it. Look how on top of things Steve is. There's also a version of this that uses a typical 4-pin Molex connector, and then some boards you'll even see that just have a serial ATA power connector as well. But all of those are just to provide extra power to the PCI Express lanes, and again, that's usually an optional connector unless you're really plugging in lots of graphics cards or other add-on cards.
All right, so the next thing we're going to cover is the anatomy of the motherboard. So let's get started with the PCB.
All right, so these are all elements that we've talked about already, but we're just going to kind of go over them quickly here. The PCB is basically what you see at the back of this. It's a printed circuit board. It is what everything is connected to, and often it will have multiple layers and has a bunch of traces that are laid out in it that basically provide digital communication between the components on the board. Okay, and the socket? The socket is up here at the top. Again, this is a AMD socket, so that's a AM3 Plus. You might also have FM1 or FM2 for AMD's APUs. You might have sockets LGA 2011 for Intel's Enthusiast platform, or LGA 1150 for Intel's current 4th generation mainstream platform. Okay, next up, chipset. The chipsets, this motherboard has 2 of them since it has a north bridge and a south bridge. The north bridge is located right underneath this heatsink. The south bridge is located right under this heatsink. And then for Intel boards right now, and for AMD's FM1 and FM2 boards, there's just a single chipset, and that's usually beneath the largest heatsink that you see on the board, apart from the VRMs. Okay, and next up, VRM. VRMs are located around the CPU sockets. Often you will see that they have some passive cooling on them. You'll even see active cooling on them sometimes. Their job is to provide power to the CPU, and there's also, it will be a big impact on the overclocking capabilities of the board depending on how beefy the VRM solution is. Memory slots? Memory slots are usually also located adjacent to the CPU socket, so on here they're just to the right. For a Intel board, for example, like this one, they actually have it set up so you have 2 sets of banks, 4 on either side of the CPU. Typically, all motherboards right now have DDR3 memory. We might see DDR4 start to be introduced next year, and just make sure that you get a dual channel kit or a quad channel kit as necessary depending on the platform that you're running on, and DDR3, and then choose whatever speed you're willing to pay for and that is compatible with your chosen CPU. And next up we have power connectors. Power connectors, you have a main power connector on this board. It's located over here on the right. That's 20 or 24 pin. Then you'll always, or pretty much always, have a supplemental CPU power connector. On this board, it's an 8-pin up here. Sometimes you'll also see that in a 4-pin trim. Fan connectors. Fan connectors, we actually have not mentioned yet at this point, but I always recommend, if you have the option, to plug your case fans directly into your motherboard. That will give you some additional control over them. On this board, for example, you can see some 4-pin fan connectors up here at the top. There's also 3-pin fan connectors, but the 4-pin fan connectors will give you PWM, or pulse width modulation control, which I find to be a superior method than voltage control. But you also see 3-pin fan connectors that give voltage control as well. And by connecting them to the motherboard rather than directly to the power supply, you'll actually be able to control the RPMs of those fans so you can quiet off your system if necessary. If you plug them directly into your power supply, they're always going to run at full speed and you'll have a much louder system, albeit with good airflow.
Okay, so then we need to know, where are the front panel connectors?
Front panel connectors is another element that we hadn't pointed out yet, but they're located in the very bottom right on this particular motherboard. That's usually where I find them, so it's this tiny little bank of white pinouts right there. Basically, if you have a computer case and that computer case has, say, a power button or a reset button, then there's some way for that button that needs to connect to the motherboard to tell the computer to turn on. That is where front panel connectors come into play. You'll typically have a power button, a reset button. You'll have LEDs for power and hard drive activity. And then you'll also have a speaker connector, which may or may not be included with your case to have an actual speaker so you can listen to post codes. One thing to keep in mind here is that whereas your power switch and your reset switch are not directional, so you can plug in those little pinouts either way, the LEDs are, so you should pay attention to positive and negative markings on your LED connectors.
All right, so the next thing we're looking for are the expansion slots, PCI, PCIe, etc.
Okay, expansion slots are all located right here. Again, you'll have typically a single one on a mini ITX board, 4 on a micro ATX board, and 7 or sometimes 8 on a standard ATX board. And these are all PCI Express, these ones that you can see right here. So this is a full length, this is an X1 slot right there. And then this right here is a PCI slot, not Express. So this is what is known as a legacy port, slightly older. It's still an expansion port, and you'll still find these on some motherboards because if somebody has a piece of hardware that fits into a PCI slot and it was really expensive or they really like how it performs, sometimes even with a newer motherboard you might want to carry that card over and be able to plug it in. You'll also see older motherboards which will have other expansion slot types such as AGP, which is accelerated graphics port, which is not used at all anymore. And then if you go way far back, you can find ISA, and I'm sure there's older ones than that, which I cannot remember off the top of my head.
So where are the SATA ports?
Yes, your
SATA ports.
SATA serial ATA ports are on this board, right angled over on this side. So as you can see, they're keyed. They have a little L shape to them, so you can only plug them in one way. And this is something where you should definitely check your motherboard manual or the specs that are available online to double check whether you're looking at serial ATA revision 2 or revision 3 ports, so you can determine what their throughput is, particularly if you're going to be connecting up an SSD, because you will want to plug in an SSD to a SATA revision 3 port. Apart from the right angled ones like that, you'll also sometimes see direct plugs like this. So these are not angled, they just plug straight in directly to the board.
So the I/O, which is the input-output.
Yes, I/O is, at least in the sense that we're talking about right here, is located at the back of the board. So here you'll typically, your motherboard and the accessories, which we're going to go over in just a moment, will have a shield that goes over this, or at least protects the gaps in between. You install that in your case. But that will give you most of the external connectivity on the computer. So just to go over some of the connection points here, we have this purple and green port. That's a PS2 port, which is also a slightly older connection point, but if you have a mouse or a keyboard that uses that and you really like it, you might want to make sure that you have that on your motherboard. USB, which is almost always going to be either USB 2 or USB 3 right now. USB 3 just gives you additional bandwidths for faster connectivity and transfers. But this one has a bunch of USB 2.0 ports, the black ones here, as well as the 4 that are right here. USB 3.0 usually is going to have a blue connector, so those are indicated by the USB 3.0 ports there, as well as down here. You might have eSATA, which is an external serial ATA connector. This is the same type of connection as those internal serial ATA ports, but it has a different type of connector that's made to be more rugged for external use. So if you have an external hard drive and you want a nice, solid, fast connection for it, eSATA is a good way to go. You might have some audio connection points. So for example, this is what is known as a Toslink connection right here, SPDIF. It's an actual optical connector. You'll often see these on game consoles as well. But if you have a home theater piece, if you have a home theater audio system or something like that, this is often a pretty good way to connect over an optical connection over to that. Of course, you can also just go with HDMI or something along those lines. This is a BIOS reset button. We actually haven't talked much about BIOS yet, but we should probably do that. But basically, at some points, you might want to refresh your BIOS and get it back to factory default states. This is an external one of those, which can just be a bit more convenient method to access that than if it was internally, and allows you to not have to actually open up your computer case. You will always have networking on modern motherboards, and there's a couple different ways. So this is an integrated RJ45 plug, which means that there's an actual networking chip that they've integrated onto the board. So you can plug that in directly via a wired connection and get your internet set up if you want to route that over to your modem or your router. You'll often see wireless connections on motherboards as well, which I'll come back to in just a moment. And then since you will almost always also have integrated audio as part of the motherboard as well, these are the audio connection points for that. These are analog, so this motherboard has 7.1 channel audio, so that's all of the colored ports right here. The green is just your standard stereo audio connection, and then the pink is pretty much always going to be your microphone line in. Since I mentioned wireless, I also have a motherboard here with integrated wireless, so actually a few things I can talk about here. So these are your wireless connection points, and that's just basically routes over to a wireless chip that's on the board itself. And those are your antenna leads. So basically it'll ship with an antenna in the box, connect those up, and that will give you much better connectivity there. And then since we've mentioned that some of the CPUs you can buy have integrated graphics, so that's another thing that you will frequently see on the back of those types of motherboards is video outs as well. So this one has HDMI as well as DVI out.
The last thing we need to talk about in the anatomy of our motherboard is the additional features, which include things such as a debug LED, surface-mounted power, the BIOS switches you mentioned, and
yes,
so
and
forth.
these are, so when we talked at the beginning about the performance, like CPU to CPU performance across different platforms and how that's not likely to change based on using a different motherboard, this is really an area where motherboard manufacturers can do a lot to add extra features that people might want to use, which might make their motherboard a bit more attractive to prospective buyers. So to start off, here's the Gigabyte G1 Sniper M5, and this is a gaming series motherboard from Gigabyte, so they've done some extra work here, specifically for gamers and DIYers. But here's surface-mounted buttons for examples. As you can see, big red power button right there that you can use. That's very helpful because a lot of times when you're building a new system, you'll actually assemble it sort of outside of the case, test out your parts before you do all that installation, because if you do happen to have something that's defective, it's helpful to identify that right off the bat. So having that button allows you to turn the system on and off without having it wired up to your front panel connectors on your case. There's also a reset button right there, so simply does the reset function. And we also mentioned that rear-mounted clear CMOS button on the Sabertooth board from Asus, and Gigabyte has put a clear CMOS button that's also located on the motherboard right there that you can push to clear the CMOS. Another thing that this board has on it is located right here. This is what's known as a debug LED. Now, again, some of the hesitations that people have when they're building their own computer is, well, are all the parts compatible? And, well, if I get everything connected and I hit that power button and something is going wrong, how will I know what it is? A debug LED can be very, very helpful for that, because basically as your computer is going through post, power on self-test, which means it's going and accessing your BIOS or your UEFI, it's loading up really, really low-level functions. It hasn't even started loading the operating system yet. This little debug LED will show a series of codes as it is going through each step of that process. So if your computer is suddenly stopping and restarting itself over and over again, you can look at that debug LED, see what code is listed out there when it does that, and maybe it says, oh, it's a RAM initialization thing it's going through. Then you can have a much better idea, well, it's probably, maybe my RAM's not seated correctly, or maybe I'm using incompatible memory, or maybe I'm using the wrong memory slots, something like that. So I really love a debug LED on a motherboard. It's super helpful for troubleshooting, even though you really hope that you don't actually ever need to use it. And then another thing a debug LED will often do is display something useful like the CPU temperature once the system has actually gotten all the way through and is up and running. So there's a few examples of some add-ons on this Gigabyte board. Another thing that motherboard manufacturers might do is add on higher quality integrated sound components. So this board actually has a Soundcore 3D Creative Sound Blaster chip that's integrated onto it, so that's going to give you better audio, since motherboards can often have a bit of a reputation for having mediocre onboard audio. It gets the job done, but if you have a really nice set of headphones, then looking for a motherboard that does that. And then more recently, Gigabyte has actually been giving you a swappable op amp, which is this little chip right there. So you can actually pull that out, drop in another one. That's a bit more of a niche feature, which some folks are going to be more interested than others in seeing. But there's some examples of some stuff Gigabyte has done as far as integration onto boards. And you'll find those features across lots of different manufacturers' boards, so those aren't necessarily exclusive to Gigabyte or anything like that. Here's a closer look at the Asus Sabertooth board that we're using as an example here. This is just a green LED. It's a light that turns on when the power is connected to the board and the power switch is turned on the power supply. I found that to be useful just for a quick glance to know if the board has power going to it or not, because you never want to like remove graphics cards or anything unless you've switched off the power from your power supply. Asus also over on the right side here has a little button called Direct Key, which I've been growing more and more fond of, because some of the motherboards now with the current generation processors, and if you're using Windows 8 for example, can boot so fast that it's difficult to get into the BIOS. You usually have to push a button or something. And that Direct Key, you push that button, reboot the system, and it will automatically go into the BIOS. You don't have to spam the delete button or anything like that. Also, just from a build quality standpoint, you'll find Asus, with their Sabertooth boards in particular, they're going to be using military spec components, so that adhere to military standards for operation under a wider range of temperatures, for example, or to be able to deal with humidity or something like that. So if you're in a more exotic environment, or if you're just into purchasing something that's going to have a really long lifespan. Asus also does a thing called Mem-OK, a little button that's up there in the top right. Since memory compatibility can often be an issue with motherboards, you can hit that little Mem-OK button and it will cycle through a bunch of different memory profiles to try to get something that's compatible with the memory that you're using there. They've also, on this board, scattered a bunch of temperature read points throughout the board, so you can load up the software afterwards to get a much better idea of what different parts of the board are running at different temperatures. You can have LEDs on the board, like this little DRAM LED. So this is something we've seen from Asus as well as some other motherboard manufacturers. Kind of like that debug LED readout that I showed you, but these are specific to certain components on the board. So if you're trying to start up and it's freezing on the memory initialization, that DRAM LED will light up, and again, that's going to help you out with troubleshooting. So those are some examples of some stuff. This is not meant to be an exhaustive list of all the different types of sort of special features and add-ons that motherboard manufacturers can do, but I do have a couple more examples down over here, actually. So here on this EVGA board, you can see they've also got a debug LED mounted right there. They also have a BIOS switch, so it's a physical switch. It's on the board, and there's text to it as well right there, BIOS select. So the BIOS, again, is sort of that low-level initialization set of code that it goes through, and sometimes you can have different BIOSes. So some boards will ship with more than one on the board. They'll let you switch back and forth between them, and that can be a good way to recover. For example, if for some reason you've managed to corrupt your BIOS, which is difficult to do but can happen, or it can give you the ability to set up two different profiles for the board, so you can switch back and forth between an overclocking bunch of settings in one BIOS and then switch over to a stock settings on the other one, so you can sort of turn that on and off, and that's a way that you can do that. So again, by no means an exhaustive list of the different types of add-ons and special features that we can see on motherboards, but those are the type of things that a lot of times they'll do to distinguish themselves.
I think it's a good idea to give everybody a reasonable knowledge of what they can expect to see on a motherboard, so they're not looking at any one part and going, ooh, that's fancy, what's that?
Yes.
You know, so they just give them a good idea of what to expect when they open it up and take a look at it. And I think that is a good segue to our next portion of the video, which is going to be opening up a motherboard box, what you can expect inside, and a quick install.
All right, so let's move on to that.
Let's move on. All right, now let's get to, you've learned everything about motherboards, you've coordinated all of your pieces, now you're ready to open up the box. Let's take a look at what you can typically expect to find inside a motherboard box.
So this is the Gigabyte G1 Sniper A88X, which we kind of chose at random from the motherboards that we have available right now. But this is another question that comes through all the time is you're building a new computer, what parts do you get? Am I going to have that cable to connect up my hard drive and all that sort of thing? So this is a pretty standard example of what you might expect from a motherboard box. So first off, you do have some serial ATA cables. We mentioned that just about any drives that you might connect to your computer right now would be an optical drive, a serial ATA SSD, or a serial ATA mechanical spinning hard drive. So these cables are pretty standard. Most of the time, serial ATA cables will be just fine for SATA revision 1, 2, or 3, so don't worry about it being a specific type of serial ATA cable. And then another thing, just when it comes to cables themselves, is you might notice a couple like this. These are straight plugs, and then you might have some that come with little angled plugs. These are not necessarily better or worse, they're just situational. Sometimes you'll have a drive that's right up against the side panel of your case or something, and a 90-degree angle plug will be more appropriate. Other times, if you're plugging in serial ATA cables to, for instance, those little stacks of 2 serial ATA plugs, you'll want to use the straight plugs. That way you won't block one of your other plugs. So there's some serial ATA cables. This one happens to come with 4 of them, so you're pretty much set for the number of drives that you might expect a user to have in any given system. This is known as your input-output shield, so we'll be doing a quick install of this in just a moment. But basically, it provides some additional protection at the back of your computer, also labeling for those I/O plugs, so you can kind of tell what is what. And then there's different types of these. You'll find some that have a bit of kind of this squishiness on the back that I like. Other ones will just have little metal prongs that stick out, and those are there to help ground the whatever plug that you're plugging into. That way you don't discharge some static electricity, which can sometimes mess with your system. Actually, let me come back to that. That's that's an SLI bridge. Apart from that, in this box, we have a driver disc. Now, driver discs get a bad rap a lot of the time. Usually when I take out a driver disc, I say, here's a driver disc. The drivers are already outdated. Go to the manufacturer's website. And that's usually the best thing to do. Go straight to the Gigabyte website, look up your motherboard, go to their support and their download section. You can download what is most likely updated drivers. However, some driver discs do contain utilities that aren't available for download on the website, so that's one thing to bear in mind. And then another thing is, how do you connect to the internet in the first place in order to download those drivers?
Right.
Well, if you have another computer, you can do it there, pop it onto a USB drive and bring it over, that's no problem. But if this is your only computer, you might need to load up this disk and at least install the LAN or internet drivers. So if you have a wireless device or an integrated network interface card, at least load those up. That way you can connect to the internet in order to download the rest of the drivers. So
of course, if you're building a system with no optical drive,
then that becomes more of an issue, yes, and a very good point to bring up. In that case, you would definitely need to borrow another computer, go to a friend's house, something like that, download the drivers onto a USB drive so that you can bring them over to your system. You get a case badge from Gigabyte, and this is also quite common to get a little badge. This is optional, of course, but if you like to broadcast the components that are inside your case on the outside of your case, there's a little case badge. You'll find different case badges from different manufacturers. Here's the user's manual, and this is an invaluable asset to have while you're building your computer. You often hear people say, I'm just going to chuck the manual aside and I'm going to forge ahead. Well, there's certain things that aren't quite intuitive. You don't always know exactly how things are going to work out. So I like the Gigabyte manuals. They give you a block diagram of how everything's connected in the system, so I often find that to be helpful. They'll also have a full layout of the board over on this side, which will kind of tell you what is what, and for instance, which your PCI Express X16 lanes and PCI X4, for example. It will it should always have product specifications over here on the right. This is going to tell you what APUs are compatible. Speaking of compatibility, every motherboard will have a CPU compatibility list, so if you want to be absolutely sure that the CPU you're choosing is compatible with the motherboard, go to the motherboard manufacturer's website, look for CPU compatibility, and you can find a full list there. Sometimes you'll need to update your motherboard's BIOS to the latest version in order to get compatibility with all modern CPUs and APUs, so that's something to bear in mind as well. But here's how you can tell, for instance, what type of network card they've gone with this one, which happens to be a Realtek one. Your different expansion slots and the configurations that are available right there, as well as your graphics support for if you want to connect up more than one graphics card, for example, or what types of graphics cards are going to work best. Also for storage, because often you'll have RAID configurations that are available via the native controllers that are integrated into your chipset. So that's also very useful. And then usually, moving on in the manual, you'll have sort of a guide for installing your APU or your CPU, as well as connecting up to different stuff. I would recommend going to our YouTube channel if you're not already there and checking out our How to Build a Computer video for sort of a step-by-step walkthrough of how to do all of your installation. But again, just a ton of really useful information in here that you wouldn't necessarily know right off the bat. Which serial ATA ports are which ones are natively controlled and which ones are not, for example. For memory, which I haven't come to quite yet here, but you'll often be able to find out what memory slots are the best ones to use or which ones are primary, and then it'll also take you through the BIOS setup and configuration type stuff. So again, always keep your motherboard manual on hand. I have a stack of them that I just keep around in case I ever need to reference them. They've also gone ahead and given you a multilingual installation guidebook here from Gigabyte. And then one thing that we actually added to this kit, just so we could give an example of it, using multiple video cards is growing more popular, I think, over time. Again, that's sort of going to be based on the recommendation for your use case scenario and everything. But for current generation cards, you need what is known as an SLI or a Crossfire bridge. SLI for NVIDIA, Crossfire for AMD. The SLI bridges for motherboards that support SLI will almost always come in the motherboard box.
Okay.
If you're going for a Crossfire configuration, typically those bridges will ship with the Crossfire capable graphics card. And then if you're talking about the newest generation of AMD graphics cards, those actually don't even need a bridge at all. So this is another thing that's very common to see come along with your motherboard.
Yeah, I was going to say you put an NVIDIA SLI bridge in an AMD motherboard box.
Well, that's okay. Even
okay?
AMD's sort of in an interesting position because AMD makes both the processors and AMD also makes graphics cards.
Yeah.
But that doesn't necessarily mean
You're gonna
that you
use
can't
that.
use an
Okay.
NVIDIA graphics card with an AMD processor. That's totally okay. They do play nice together, although you are correct. There's competition there. So fortunately, they've come to a consensus, and you can use NVIDIA graphics cards with an AMD platform, so that was nice of them. So here's a quick installation demo for you guys, and we're sticking with the G1 Sniper A88X. Actually, not because it is standard, but actually because it's slightly not standard. So this is a ATX form factor motherboard, but Gigabyte, because they didn't need the space, actually made it a bit narrower than a typical ATX motherboard. Standard ATX motherboards, you're going to have 9 mounting points, basically. So those are these little standoff holes right here. So with standard ATX, you'd have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. This motherboard, since it's not quite as wide, actually only has 7, which is fine, no problem. That's how it's designed. But unfortunately, we're actually missing 1 standoff point in our case. So we have this one here, but we don't have a in-betweener right there. So I'm going to show you guys a way to work around that. But 2 things to bear in mind before you do your motherboard installation, and one is going to be the CPU cooler. This is an AMD CPU, so it's got a universal backplate that's already mounted on there, and most of the coolers, or a lot of them, can actually use the integrated mounting points right here. Some of them will have you take off these top pieces and install something else. Others will actually have you replace the entire backplate as well. So always pay attention to that before you put your motherboard in your case, because it's much easier to do with the motherboard outside of the case. Some cases, like this fractal case down here, has a CPU cutout in the back, which is very handy, but sometimes it's not big enough or it's not positioned where the CPU socket is. So I recommend not always relying on that and doing your CPU cooler installation first. But apart from all that stuff, we have an I/O shield, and this needs to go in first. So basically, the color, the part with the printing is going to go towards the back of the case, and then if you're really that confused, you can kind of line it up like this to see which way it goes, like so. But basically, this is the bottom edge. So all I'm going to do is line it up with the I/O area here at the back, and sometimes it goes in easily, sometimes it does not. I like to use the butt end of a screwdriver to kind of bang onto it a little bit and pop in all 4 corners. There you go. So next we'll move back to our standoff situation. So these are standoffs, and always make sure you install them. Again, count the mounting points on your motherboard and install the appropriate number in the case. A lot of cases like this one will have actual text or something like that on the case. So this one has A and M. A is for ATX, M is for micro ATX. And then I'm also actually tightening these down a fair amount because it's generally okay to make these very, very snug. Do not over tighten them, of course. You don't want to strip the threading in the case. So I'm just going to hand tighten this with my hand, using that handy adapter. And then, oops, gotta leave that on. I will give it another quarter to a half turn with the screwdriver to make sure that that's down all the way and secure. This will make sure that when we install the screws to actually secure the motherboard, if we ever remove it, it won't back those screws off as well. But back to our dilemma and the main sort of non-standard thing when it comes to this particular video, and that is how do we deal with this last standoff point? We have it there on the motherboard, but not on the case. There's a couple things we could do. I would be okay just not having a standoff there, but bear in mind this side of the board is going to be kind of suspended, and you might want to be careful about putting pressure, for example, when you actually plug in your main 24-pin power connector. But fortunately, since we have lots of little computer hardware bits lying around here, I found something which is a bit better of a solution. Thank you very much, Jenny. And that is a plastic standoff. So this is a standoff that's meant to basically give some support to the underside of the motherboard. It does have adhesive on the back side, which is why it's stuck to my finger. And this will allow us to get some support underneath that standoff point without necessarily needing compatibility with the case. So the way I'm going to do this is actually just to take that and pop it through the underside, like so, and then it's just going to kind of hang there loosely. And then when I drop the motherboard in, the adhesive will naturally go to the point on the motherboard back plate, or the motherboard tray down there, where it should go. So that's pretty much that. So from there I can go ahead and drop this in. Now I did check to see if there's any plastic pieces on here, little caps, which are there to help protect that, but can get in the way during installation. I'm going to drop the I/O part down first at a bit of an angle, just so I can kind of get it lined up. Then I'll drop the rest of the board down in. I'm applying pressure from the right side of the board because there's a little bit of push on this side that's needed to get those lined up. And then pushing that over, I'm watching my standoff points here to make sure those are lined up. And then I can give a little bit of downward push on my plastic standoff just to make sure that that gets its adhesive in there. So everything's lined up here, and really all that's left is to add some screws to the standoff points. So I'm going to go ahead and use my magnetized screwdriver here, which is perfectly safe. Don't worry about magnetized screwdrivers. They're not magnetized enough to do any damage to the motherboard, but that will allow me to really get that lined up there and drop it down in. And then I'm just going to go ahead and get it just barely snug on there before I add screws to some of the opposite corners. And I'm starting with kind of a central mounting point right here for starters. And there is our last screw. And again, this is not a full tutorial on motherboard installation, but these are the elements that I find are most key to getting your motherboard installed properly.
All right, everybody, thank you for joining us for the motherboard category video and coming along with me on this learning opportunity that Paul has given us today.
Well, thank you for asking me to come and help learn you, or with your learning.
All right,
Yeah.
And as with everything, if you've liked or enjoyed this video, please like it and be sure to subscribe to all of our various Newegg YouTube channels. And until next time, I'm Jennifer.
And I'm Paul.
And thank you for watching Newegg TV.